Hello, this is Michael Dowd, and this is part 3 of a 5-part video discussion series, the beta version, called God in Big History. Number 3 is titled Reality Rules, and I'll be receiving feedback, inviting feedback, suggestions for improvement, criticism over the next 2 months in July and August 2014, and then I'll be incorporating that and uploading an edited version, final version, up on YouTube for religious and secular study groups in early September. Just to recap what we've already covered in the first session, each of these is about 30-35 minutes long. The first one was called The Big Picture, and we covered what big history is and why it's important, and how a big history view of God and religion differs from other approaches. In the second session, which was titled Sacred Science, we covered what big history reveals about the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious and inspirational significance of science, and how our sources of knowledge and wisdom have expanded through time. In this session, we're going to discover or explore the question, what and where is God in big history, and why does it matter? And as I've mentioned previously, my TEDx talk delivered in May in Grand Rapids, Reality Reconciles Science and Religion, is sort of an introduction to this series. What we call reality or nature, the ancients called God or the gods. I mean, right relationship to reality is what matters for humans. It's what matters for all species. And words create worlds, and language changes over the centuries. And when you realize that, it goes back to that previous one, that what we call reality or nature, the ancients called God or the gods. The Hebrews didn't have a word called nature. They didn't have a word called reality. Most ancient cultures didn't. A big history approach to reality synthesizes. It's a synthesis position. It's neither just science nor religion, but it synthesizes head and heart by transcending and including reason and faith, facts and values. Because honoring both sides of the equation, how things are and which things matter, is essential for human survival. Big history is humanity's first and only creation story derived from global collective learning. And it's a secular story, but it nevertheless reveals a way of thinking and speaking about God or the gods that is undeniably and inescapably real. That's the case I'm going to be making in this session. Now, what I'm calling God 3.0 or Religion 3.0, I also refer to as the Evidential Reformation. And there are 4 distinctions that I think are at the heart of this. Again, God 3.0 is not a God you can believe in or disbelieve in. It's a God that's undeniably, inescapably real. It's reality personified. Religion 3.0, Religion 1.0 is the authority of elders. Religion 2.0 is the authority of Scripture or the authority of the sacred text. Religion 3.0 is the authority of global collective intelligence. It's the authority of science, the authority of evidence. So these 4 distinctions, I think, are vital to the Evidential Reformation, which is impacting every religion in the world and obviously also the secular world. Practical versus factual truth, or practical knowledge versus factual knowledge. Day language versus night language, which corresponds to the different ways the different hemispheres, the left and right parts of our brain, the left hemispheres of our brain communicate. Public revelation versus private revelation, which is sort of objective and subjective reality. And then unnatural deities or fictional deities versus undeniable deities or factual deities. As I've thought about it, there's actually a 5th distinction that I'm not going to be covering here that could be said adolescent science versus mature science. Adolescents reject so much of their parents without really understanding. And when we become fully functional, healthy adults, we tend to have compassion for our parents because we have a level of understanding that we couldn't when we were adolescent. Well, in the same way, adolescent science has rejected religion without truly understanding it. And now that same science is helping us to have a science-based understanding of religion, the whole field of evolutionary religious studies, and it's a mature science. It's a science that's able to both appreciate the evolutionary role and significance of religion, but also help religions evolve. Because in their current forms, if religion is simply identified as otherworldly or supernatural, and it values ancient texts over current evidence, then it can lead to our demise as a species. I did a program about 1.5 years ago where there was a Christian church in Canada that was specifically wanting to know, how can we use the word God, or can we use the word God in a way that really makes sense scientifically? And that Tina Turner song, "What's Love Got to Do with It?" Well, I created my own sort of humorous version here, so, humor me here. What's God got to do with it? What's God but an ancient mythic notion? What's God got to do with it? Who needs Poseidon? Plate tectonics made the ocean. So that's what we're going to talk about, is what's God got to do with it? And can we use God? Can we use the word God in a way that's inescapably real and grounded in our best evidential understanding of reality? I suggest that we can. In fact, I suggest that we must. Not that everybody must, but certainly that religious people must. So the first distinction is the distinction between practical truth, or practical knowledge, and factual truth, or factual knowledge. David Sloan Wilson, one of the world's leading evolutionary theorists, I mentioned him earlier, his book Darwin's Cathedral, which is one of the best books on the evolutionary significance of religion. He's written 2 other fabulous books, Evolution for Everyone and The Neighborhood Project, using evolution to improve my city 1 block at a time. So I highly recommend David's writings. But this distinction between, he calls practical realism and factual realism, it's really important to get this, because no religion in the world is factually true. Not one. I mean, we've only had the distinction, of fact for maybe 550 years. But virtually every religion that's existed for any length of time is almost by definition practically true. That is, if you align your life and your society with those belief systems, you'll experience personal wholeness, social coherence, and all the feeling states that humans have needed to thrive, such as trust, gratitude, inspiration, comfort, and that sort of thing. I covered this in session 1. Here's a quote that reflects this distinction between practical and factual truth by Tempest Williams. "The eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they are praying for us to see beyond our own time. They are kneeling with hands clasped, that we might act with restraint, that we might leave room for the life that is destined to come." Now, clearly, that's not factually true. It's metaphorical. It's practically true in the sense that if we act as if this is true, we experience good fruit in our lives, and we experience our lives making a difference. So it's practical truth. The next distinction is the distinction between day language and night language. Day language reflecting our everyday discourse, night language reflecting our nighttime experience, and as we all know, the two are very different. I mean, we do things at night in our dreams, for example, that you just can't do during the day, or you wouldn't do. We fly in our dreams. But when we fly in our dreams, we're not having a supernatural experience. We're having an experience common to the dream state. If you could do during the day what you do at night in your dreams, we'd all be having supernatural or miraculous experiences, every day or every night. But we don't call our dreams supernatural, nor do we call them miraculous, although we do sometimes call them bizarre. But our dreams are only bizarre if we judge our nighttime experience by daytime standards. When you're in the midst of a dream, it's not bizarre, it's just your dream. Like, you could say it this way, that day language is just what's so. It's the facts. It's what's objectively real. It's publicly, measurably true. It's factual truth. Night language is, what does it mean? It's the interpretation. It's what's subjectively real. It's personally and culturally truthful. It's practical truth. And both of these are necessary in the same way that our daytime and nighttime experiences are necessary. I mean, if you keep any mammal from dreaming, it will die. There's something about the mammalian brain. We have to dream or we'll die. So it's about valuing both of these, but not conflating the two, not confusing the two. In fact, we did a program 6 or 7 years ago down in Florida where there was a woman who came up to Connie afterwards and said that she had been reading to her, I think it was 5-year-old daughter a few nights earlier. And she said, I decided I was going to try to read some nonfiction at bedtime. And she said about 20 seconds into it, my daughter stopped me and said, no, Mommy, that's a daytime book. Read me a nighttime book, Mommy. Out of the mouths of babes. The third distinction is the distinction between public revelation and private revelation. Private revelation is an insight that comes to through the psyche of one individual. It's an insight or a revelation or profound thought that comes to one person, and then that person has to communicate it to others, and others either believe it or not. Private revelation, by its very nature, produces believers or unbelievers. Because if I have a profound insight and I tell you about it, you might believe me, you might not. It's not evidential. It's subjective. It's intuitive. It's mystical, you could say. Public revelation is what science specializes in. Public revelation is reality revealing truth, not just to one individual, but to the entire human community, to the entire community of scientists. And public revelation isn't better than private revelation. In fact, so oftentimes, private revelation is how things that have now become public revelation were first introduced. I mean, Einstein has a vision of riding a beam of light. That's a private revelation. But then he published a paper, and the whole scientific community went to work trying to disprove it. The skeptical scientific method is all about discerning, is this truth claim that's being made true in a way that Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, and atheists can all agree it's true? Or is it merely said to be true because some charismatic person said it, or because it's been passed down for so many generations that we just assume it must be true? And as I said, public revelation isn't better, but it's almost always more widely useful. More people and more diverse kinds of people can come to agree upon the nature of what's real and what's important, thanks to public revelation. Now, for example, if you lived in the Pacific Northwest, which is where this picture was taken, and there was this enormous boulder in the middle of a field, no other mountains anywhere nearby, and it was clearly made of lava, but even without knowing that, you just got this huge boulder. How would you or your people, what would your tribe or your culture or your group of people say? What story would you tell about how that boulder got there? I mean, anything this weird or this interesting or this cool demands a story. So not having a story wasn't an option. So, 500, 1,000 years ago, God did it would have been the way most cultures would have talked about how that boulder got there, or Great Spirit, or whatever, the goddess. But, some divine name, God, goddess, Great Spirit, put it there, and you would have had lots of different stories depending upon the culture about how God did it, but that God did it would have been the way most cultures would have talked about how that boulder got there. Well, then, in the 20th century, we start seeing geologists like J. Harlan Bretz started noticing interesting geological features in the Pacific Northwest. And now there's not a geologist in the world that would debate how that boulder got there. 17 times the glaciers have come south and the glaciers have gone back. Just over the last 2.5 million years. And when they came down, they blocked the Clark Fork River and created Glacial Lake Missoula, this humongous lake that was almost as large as Lake Superior. And then when it was filled up, it broke the ice dam, and within 48 hours, all of this water rushed to the Pacific Ocean. And these icebergs would carry boulders along the way and drop them along the way. And of course, the water couldn't get out of the Willamette Valley south of Portland. And so that's why that's such a fertile valley. And so, as I say, now nobody debates how that boulder got there. And it's not, geologists would say, God didn't do it. It happened through natural causes. Well, what we can finally now appreciate is these are different ways of saying essentially the same thing. The words God and evolution are both pointing to the same divine creative process. Both answer the question, how did we get here? How did everything get here? One uses the night language or mythic language of religion. The other uses the day language or the literal language, the empirical language of science. Arguing whether it was God or evolution that created everything is like debating whether it's Uncle Sam or the U.S. government that insists that we pay taxes every year. Or like quarreling over whether it was Gaia or plate tectonics that created the oceans and the mountains. Such silly and largely unnecessary confusion will remain the norm until we get and celebrate personification and can readily distinguish factual and practical truth, day and night language, public and private revelation, and unnatural and undeniable gods. Now, I haven't said anything about that yet. I'll get to that here in just a minute. Big history reveals why personification is the key to understanding the world's myths and religions and distinguishing factual from fictional claims about God or the gods. I would say that personification, that our brains are inherently relational, that's what our brains do instinctually. In the same way that we instinctually get hungry, we instinctually personify. That's how we relate to our world. That's throughout history, that's what we've done. In fact, James Hillman, one of the leading psychologists of the 20th century, in his book Revisioning Psychology, which were his, I think, Terry lectures at Yale, he said, loving is a way of knowing, and for love to know, it must personify. Personifying is thus the heart's mode of knowing. It's not a lesser, primitive way of apprehending, but a finer one. To enter myth, we must personify, And to personify carries us into myth. Now, he's using the word myth not as an untrue story, but in the same way that Joseph Campbell used the term. That is a narrative that helps us relate to reality in a healthy way. It helps us to feel our place in the cosmos, our connection to reality. Martin Buber, the great Jewish theologian in the mid-20th century, wrote a book called I and Thou. And what he talked about is the profound difference between an I-thou relationship to reality, or any aspect of reality, and an I-it relationship. And what he suggested was that if we treat anybody or any aspect of nature as an it to be used and exploited by us, rather than a thou to be honored and respected in its own right, he said that the divine is not present, God is not present, the holy is not present. And I would suggest that if we continue to relate to nature as an it to be used and exploited, we will cause our own extinction. It's that significant. In fact, that's exactly what we've been doing. We've been relating to nature for the last 500 years as a complex clock, the clockwork universe, the mechanistic paradigm is what it's sometimes called. And once you think of nature as a clock, what happened was we invented clocks, pendulum clocks. But we use that as our analogy for nature. And once you think of nature as a complex clock, the only place God can be, I think I talked about this in session 1, is the clockmaker outside a clockwork universe. So we trivialize God. God is no longer immanent and omnipresent. God is no longer inescapably real. God is now an idea, a being imagined to be outside the universe, a mechanistic universe, a supernatural being, and so nature becomes an it that we can use and exploit, and that's one of the major problems that we now have. And also, we then trivialize God, and we trivialize God's word. That is, what we think of as divine revelation, we think of as locked up in ancient texts, rather than through all forms of evidence interpreted collectively. 2 profoundly important quotes on exactly this topic, that relating to nature as a complex clock is deadly and will cause our own extinction. Thomas Berry, one of my mentors, main mentors, he said, "The world we live in is an honorable world, and to refuse this deepest instinct of our being, to deny honor where honor is due, is to place ourselves on a head-on collision course with the ultimate forces of the universe." He said, "This question of honor must be dealt with before any other question. It's ultimately not a political, economic, or even an environmental issue. It's ultimately a question of honor. Only the sense of the violated honor of Earth and the need to restore that honor will awaken in humans the energy needed to co-create a just and healthy future." Gregory Bateson, one of the leading thinkers of the 20th century, said something very similar, in fact, even a little stronger, if you can believe it. He said, if you imagine God as outside and beyond creation, vis-a-vis creation, and you have the sense that you are created in the image of God, you'll naturally and logically see yourself as above and outside the things around you. And as you unrightfully claim all mind to yourself, you'll see the world around you as mindless and therefore not entitled to moral or ethical consideration. The world will seem to be yours to exploit. Your survival unit will be you and your folks against the survival unit of other people and the brutes and vegetables. He said, if this is your estimate of your relationship to nature, and you have an advanced technology, your likelihood of survival will be that of a snowball in hell. You will die either of the toxic byproducts of your own hate or simply from overpopulation and overgrazing. And I would add climate change. The world is not a machine. It's not like a machine. It's self-organizing. And we need to relate to it in an honorable, respectful, I-thou way. One of my intellectual mentors in seminary was Ludwig Wittgenstein. He coined the term language games. He loved pissing off other philosophers and many theologians because he said basically most philosophical problems and virtually all theological problems are caused because we don't understand the way language works. Words create worlds, and language changes over time. I've mentioned this previously. For example, these words and these concepts didn't exist for the Hebrews. Life, time, wind, breath, reality, nature, climate, universe, and environment. None of those words existed for the Hebrews. None of those concepts existed for the Hebrews. Now, clearly, what we mean by these words obviously existed. But these would have all been interpreted using I, thou. In fact, the Hebrew name for both what we call wind and breath, the Hebrews called ruach. Ruach Adonai, Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God. In other words, they had a personal I-thou relationship to wind and breath. They didn't relate to it as an it. They related to it as a thou. This was the Spirit of God. And you didn't need to believe in the Spirit of God. You could not experience the Spirit of God. You're going to experience the wind. And you experience the breath until the day you die, the moment you die. And when you die, the Spirit leaves you. You don't breathe. This does not have to be understood in another worldly way. And all of these things, all of these concepts would have been interpreted. They couldn't have not been interpreted. And largely for the Hebrews, they were interpreted as the Lord Almighty, Yahweh. This is the heart of what I want to say in this program. The distinction between fictional and factual understanding of God or gods and spiritual entities. Or you could say unnatural versus undeniable. I touched on this in my TEDx talk, Reality Reconciles Science and Religion, but here let me go into it a little bit more deeply. Pick any god or any goddess throughout all of history in any culture. Poseidon, for example, was not the god of the oceans or the spirit of the oceans. That's unnatural. That's fictional. Poseidon was a personification that is giving human attributes to what's other than human, more than human. And in fact, you don't need to believe in, it doesn't matter whether you believe in Poseidon or not. The oceans are real. The seas are real. Helios was not the god of the sun or the spirit of the sun. This is where anthropology has taken us down a dead-end path. Helios was a personification of what we today call, in a depersonalized way, the sun, little s. Doesn't matter whether you believe in Helios or not. Great soul, as the way the Romans would say it. Helios is real. Gaia, same thing. Eros, same thing. I mean, it didn't matter whether you believe in Eros or not, right? Eros was a personification of what we today call love or lust. And one of the reasons why the ancients spoke about the immortality of the gods is that, humans come and humans go. Humans are born, humans die. Lust is always there. Gaia is always there. Helios is always there. Poseidon is always there. These are eternal, at least from our perspective. And you don't have to take my word on it. If you Google any of these terms, anthropomorphism, deities, personification, gods, goddesses, personify. In fact, if you put gods, goddesses, personify, and then any culture, Aztec, China, India, Rome, Greece, whatever, you're going to have dozens of web pages that list all the gods and goddesses from those different cultures and what those gods and goddesses personified. If you don't get personification, you just can't possibly understand religion. You can't understand the world's myths. And notice the radical difference between believing in Poseidon and respecting Poseidon, between worshiping Gaia and honoring Gaia. This is a radical difference, and this is what Ludwig Wittgenstein was getting at. We are confused because we don't understand the way language works. I mentioned in an earlier session, Faces in the Clouds by Stuart Guthrie. This book is absolutely foundational now. It was published in 1994, I believe, Oxford University Press. And now the entire field of evolutionary religious studies, like 120 or some odd scholars, Hindu scholars, Christian scholars, Buddhist scholars, and tons of humanist and atheist scholars, all studying religion from a science-based perspective. And there's nobody that I know of in this movement that would debate or deny the centrality of personification for understanding religion. Stuart Guthrie's book, Faces in the Cloud, is now considered just the norm. Even evangelicals don't deny it. Here's an example, okay? You can talk about Satan or Christ or the gospel in an unnatural way or an undeniable way. That is, in a fictional way or a factual way. See, fictional characters exist only in two places, in the literature and in your own subjective experience. Harry Potter is a fictional character. I can read about Harry Potter, I can have an imaginary conversation in my mind in my heart about Harry Potter, but I can't experience him with my senses. I can't experience him in the real world. Well, if you think of Satan as a disembodied entity, some spirit somewhere, that's fictional. That's unnatural. Same thing with Christ. If you think of Christ as some disembodied entity floating out there, that's unnatural. That's fictional. But if you think of Satan as a personification, like Uncle Sam as a personification of the U.S. government, if you think of Satan as a personification of all the forces inside of us and outside of us, all the things that would lead us to be out of integrity, to lessen the quality of our life and our relationships, to diminish our legacy, then that's factual. That's undeniable. There are, in fact, my TEDx talk that I did in Grand Rapids 2 years ago called Why We Struggle, it was exactly on this topic. You know, we struggle, we're tempted. The reason we get easily addicted and our kids and grandkids get addicted isn't because our great-great-great-great-grandmother ate an apple. It's because we have mismatched instincts and we live in a world of supernormal allurements. So this understanding is really vital. I mentioned earlier in the last session that supernatural as a concept only emerged roughly 500 years ago when we started understanding things in a natural, factual way. It was only then that we began to that some people began using language of the supernatural, the otherworldly. You know, prior to that, there was the seen and the unseen. There was the ordinary and the extraordinary. You know, but as I said before, when you fly in your dreams, you're not having a supernatural experience. And most people, when they really stop and think about it, when you realize that supernatural is by definition unnatural, that is, anything that's supposedly supernatural is going to be unnatural by definition. Unnatural is pretty uninspiring. For example, does this sound like the gospel? Does this sound like the great news to you? An unnatural king who occasionally engages in unnatural acts, you know, supernatural interventions, sends his unnatural son to the earth in an unnatural way. He's born through an unnatural birth, lives an unnatural life, performing all sorts of unnatural deeds, and is killed naturally. He then unnaturally raises from the dead in order to redeem us from an unnatural curse brought about by an unnaturally talking snake. After 40 days of unnatural appearances to some of his followers, he unnaturally zooms off to heaven to return to his unnatural father to sit on an unnatural throne and to unnaturally judge the living and the dead. And if you profess to believe in all this unnatural activity, you and your fellow believers get to go to an unnaturally boring place for an unnaturally long period of time, while everybody else suffers an unnatural, torturous hell forever. Now, if the gospel, the great news, has been reduced to that, is it really a surprise that the new atheists are writing bestseller lists and that young people are leaving the church by the millions? See, a factual view of God transcends belief or disbelief. It doesn't matter whether you believe in reality or not. Reality is something that every plant, every animal, and every human being cannot not experience, inwardly and outwardly. That's why I love this quote from Philip K. Dick. He says, reality is that which when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. Now, what is real to that degree? Well, I think time, nature, and mystery. At the very least, time is real. The past is real. 13.8 billion years of creativity made our moment possible. The future, if we act as if it's not real, we will condemn the future, and clearly the present is real. Nature is real. Our inner nature, our outer nature, our social nature, and our interpretive nature. So nature is real. But mystery is also real. Not just the realm that we don't know, but the entire realm that we don't even know that we don't know. So at the very least, whatever else reality means, whatever else God means, it's got to be a personification. God is a personification of what's fundamentally, undeniably, inescapably real. A personification of time, nature, and mystery. In fact, I call this the Anselm test. St. Anselm was a bishop in, I believe it was the 12th century. And he had the first, what he called the ontological proof of God's existence. This is what other people have called it too. And what he said was basically, if you define God as the greatest being who can possibly be imagined, and that being only exists in your imagination and in literature, then a greater being can be imagined, namely one that also exists in reality. And so any God that is considered to be less than, or not at least, a personification of time, nature, and mystery fails the Anselm test, and in my opinion deserves to be mocked, just as the new atheists do so powerfully. Every characteristic that we attribute to the divine derives from our experience of nature. If we imagine God as beautiful, gracious, loving, awesome, powerful, majestic, or faithful, it is because we have known or experienced beauty, grace, love, awe, power, majesty, or trustworthiness in the world. If we lived on the moon, and that's all we and our ancestors had ever known, all of our concepts and experience of the divine would reflect the barrenness of the lunar landscape. We speak, at least religious people, speak of a God's eye view of the world. What do we mean by that? You know, is it the view from outside, like a clockwork universe, the view from way outside the universe? I suggest to you, no. A God's eye view of the universe has got to include this. The perspective, the subjective experience through every set of eyes has got to be included in a God's eye view of the world. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the Christian church's greatest theologians, said 750 years ago that a mistake about creation will necessarily result in a mistake about God. Now, if that's true, what it means, among other things, is the more we learn about the nature of the universe, the nature of creation, if we're not updating what we mean when we even use the word God, we may have definitions and understandings of God that are so far outdated they're no longer life-giving. In fact, they may be deadly. I suggest that the most misguided, short-sighted, and perhaps even deadly advice of all time is worship the Creator, not creation, as if it were even possible to love God without honoring nature. It's not possible. Anybody who thinks that they can love God and praise God and trash the environment or treat others in an unjust way is literally out of touch with reality. Seeing God as undeniable, inescapable reality, personalized, an I-thou relationship, exercises, and I'm not talking about exercise like at the gym, I'm talking about like casting out the demon. The exercise is the boogeyman of pantheism. I mean, the word pantheism only emerged, John Tolland, in 1709, I believe it was, and it was a direct response to the mechanistic universe, the idea that God was trivialized outside the universe and nature was just a complex clock. And I'm not the only one saying this. There have been theologians, evolutionary theologians, ecological theologians that are my older brothers and sisters on the path. Sally McFague, for example, has written a number of books, just two of them here, Supernatural Christians and The Body of God in Ecological Theology. She's a foundational thinker, highly respected among Catholics and Protestants. Jack Haught, John F. Haught, has written a bunch of books. He's a major evolutionary theologian and an ecological theologian. Larry Rasmussen, his award-winning book just came out recently, Earth Honoring Faith and Earth Community, Earth Ethics. Of course, Matthew Fox has been writing for decades on ecological theology, evolutionary theology. And then more recently, Ilya Dilio has written a couple of amazing books. And there are many others. In fact, and I'm not suggesting that all these people agree with 100% of the way that I articulate it. In fact, this entire body, 38 of the world's most esteemed and respected theologians and priests and ministers and scientists. In fact, I'm just going to be silent. Just look over this list. And most of these people are significant evolutionary and ecological theologians and thinkers. I'm going to use both religious language and secular language, both night language and day language. You're going to see both are legitimate. You can't understand how God or reality created complex life if you don't understand extinctions. You can't understand how reality or God created healthy soil or lakes in the northern part of the world if you don't understand glaciers. You can't understand how God or reality created the periodic table of elements or planets or life or the very atoms of our bodies if you don't understand red giants and supernovas. Watch this photo very carefully. You surely can't understand how God or reality created continents and oceans and mountains if you don't understand plate tectonics. Folks, we've only known about extinction for 200 years, glaciers for like 160 years, supernovas and red giants for 65 years, and glaciers for some 55 years. This is evidential revelation. Evidence is how reality is revealing truth, is speaking to us today. Evidence is modern-day scripture. It's our main source of divine guidance today. Scientific evidence, historic evidence, and cross-cultural evidence. Any time, any culture, any tradition, any scriptures says God said this or God did that, what follows is always an interpretive personification. We know of no counterexamples in the history of humanity. In fact, it's our inability to read mythic literature that's made us blind and deaf, or what Thomas Berry calls autistic, to what God or reality has been revealing for centuries. I mean, you open up the book of Amos and it says, "Thus saith the Lord," and you've got 2 paragraphs. It sounds like somebody was there with a tape recorder catching some voice booming from the sky. But it wasn't that. If we could go back in time and record the moment of divine revelation, like with a TV crew, you'd see some old guy either penning himself or dictating to a scribe. What he saw was real, what he sensed was emerging, and then speaking a word of warning to the people that went basically, folks, we need to get right with reality or else. We need to get right with God or we will perish. That's the fundamental stance of a prophet. And if we don't know how to read mythic literature, we're going to be blind and deaf to what God's revealing today and who the prophets are today. See, interpreting life or reality, that is time, nature, mystery, interpreting reality in inspiring mythic ways is a sacred responsibility. Joel Primack and Nancy Ellen Abrams, they wrote The View from the Center of the Universe and the New Human and the Universe Future that I mentioned in a previous session. They said the integration of science and meaning is considered by many scientists to be a danger to science. But a science that doesn't consider its own meaning can be a danger to everyone else. Interpreting modern cosmology is, if anything is, a sacred responsibility. See, we are the meaning-making animal. That's what we do. We're inherent storytellers. We're always interpreting. And we have self-deceptive instincts. In fact, if you put cognitive biases in Google, you'll get all the, you'll get the Wikipedia page of all the different ways that we're programmed to deceive ourselves. And scientists are just as prone to self-deception as anybody else. That's why the collective enterprise, the scientific community collectively helps us make progress in terms of our understanding of what's real and what's important. We don't experience reality as it is. We experience reality through the lens of our interpretation. And mythic interpretations, I-thou interpretations, have been selected for countless times at both individual and group levels. This is really important. Individuals, and there's lots of psychological research on this, that individuals who have an optimistic or a positive viewpoint on life, even if they're deceptive, are going to be more attractive. They're going to overcome difficulties and obstacles more effectively. They're going to live longer, happier, healthier lives. And the same thing at group levels. Groups that believe that reality was on our side, that God is for us, would have outcompeted groups that didn't have that belief. We interpret reality via metaphor, by night language. We can't avoid using metaphor and night language. This is the evolutionary significance of meaning-making, that interpretation is neither optional nor factual. In other words, we can't not interpret. We're always going to be interpreting, but our interpretations are never factual. It's not, is it true in terms of interpretation, or is it correct? Rather, is this a useful interpretation? Does it serve? There's always more than one way to interpret anything. More than one depressing way and more than one inspiring way. See, I mentioned before, words create worlds. All words are symbols. Words are maps, not the territory. Words are menus, not the meal. That is, reality will always transcend anything that we can say or think about it. In other words, no language for ultimacy is literally exact or complete. To speak or even think about the nature of reality, the nature of nature, we must use metaphors and analogies. That is, we must use night language. That's why some traditions talk about the 10,000 names for God. These are 10,000 metaphors, 10,000 personifications, or what reality is like, what nature is like, what time is like, what mystery is like. As meaning-making animals, even if we say something is meaningless, we're making it mean nothing. We simply cannot not interpret our experience. And individual and collective interpretations profoundly affect the quality of our lives and our societies. This picture, by the way, is from The Matrix, if you don't recognize that. But, and by collective interpretation, let me back up. The most important skill I wish I could impart to young people would be the skill of learning to interpret life generously. Because as most of us who are over 40 and 50 know, the primary thing that will determine the quality of a person's life isn't what happens to them. It's how they interpret what happens to them. And collective interpretations, that's what political spin is. The fate of nations can be impacted by how we collectively interpret. So coming back to this use of the word God, God is a mythic name, a sacred name, an I-thou name, a personal name for life or reality or time, nature, and mystery as it really is. God is always a meaningful interpretation. There's never been the use of the word God that isn't an interpretation of some aspect of reality or reality as a whole. Said another way, God is reality personalized, not a person. In fact, all gods and goddesses are personifications, not persons. And please, no whining here, because typically at this point, theists and atheists start whining in opposite directions. Theists start saying things like, well, wait a second, are you saying that my God is only an interpretation? You know, is only a personification? Well, no, I'm saying that anything that, you know, we can say or think about God is a personification. But what reality is in its ultimate essence is beyond anything we can say, think, or imagine. But atheists typically whine in the opposite direction because, you know, they'll say, well, wait a second, if this is true, if all gods and goddesses are personifications, not persons, then that completely evaporates the, you know, the argument that God doesn't exist. Oh, that's true. And again, don't take my word on it. Read Faces in the Clouds by Stuart Guthrie. Google evolutionary religious studies and read some of the scholars, many of the scholars that are writing in this field. Google anthropomorphism, deities personification, gods, goddesses personify. You don't have to take my word on this. In fact, I would say that the biggest, well, I don't know about biggest, but one of the biggest collective insanities of our time is the theism versus atheism debate. Because you've got countless, well, not countless, thousands, you know, maybe many more people debating, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people debating whether or not God exists. While the one real God, the only God that matters, namely reality personified, nature, time, mystery personified, we've been dishonoring. We've been dishonoring nature. We've been dishonoring time. We've been dishonoring mystery. We dishonor nature when we treat it as an it to be exploited or used by us rather than a thou to be related to. We dishonor time when we think it only goes back a few thousand years or the end of the world's going to happen, so it's not going to go forward more than a few more decades. And we dishonor mystery if we think that we've got all the answers. So the one true God, namely nature, time, reality personified, but let's just stay with nature. We've been out of right relationship to nature, and we are about to experience the consequences of biblical proportion. And yet you've got millions of people debating whether or not God exists. I call that collective insanity. Evangelicals sometimes talk about a personal relationship to God. I'm an evolutionary evangelical. I'm an evangelical naturalist. And, you know, many evangelicals talk about a personal relationship to God. Well, if you don't have an honorable relationship to time, an honorable personal relationship to nature, and an honorable I-thou relationship to mystery, you don't have a personal relationship to God, and it doesn't matter what you believe. Coming back to this term, the Evidential Reformation, I think this core insight is at the heart of the Evidential Reformation as it's impacting all religions and the secular world, even though secular folks you wouldn't use the word God. Reality is God. Facts are God's native tongue. And if we don't come into right relationship with God, nature, reality, soon we will perish. Again, secular people would say reality is our ultimate commitment, our ultimate concern. Facts are the way reality is revealing itself. And if we don't come into right relationship with nature and reality soon, we're going to perish. And here are 3 fabulous books on this topic. Evolutionary Religion by J.L. Schellenberg. I'm just now halfway through reading it. It's fabulous. He has a deep time perspective, not just deep time past, but deep time future. It's excellent. Read it. Pauline Lebel, Becoming Intimate with the Earth. This is one of the best books in terms of an I-thou personal relationship to reality, to nature. And of course, you know, many religious people don't like Richard Dawkins, but frankly, I am hugely grateful that Richard and the other new atheists, Jerry Coyne, P.Z. Myers, Richard Dawkins, you know, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, I'm grateful that they're doing what they're doing because they're attacking fictional understandings of God, unnatural understandings of God, with the ferocity that those concepts deserve to be attacked, in my opinion. And this book, The Magic of Reality, is a gem, how we know what's really true. So just to recap what we've covered in session number 1, which was on the big picture, we looked at what big history is and why it's important, and how a big history view of God and religion differs from other approaches. In session 2, we looked at what big history reveals about the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious or inspirational significance of science, and how our sources of knowledge and wisdom have expanded through time. In this session, which I titled Reality Rules, we looked at what and where God is in big history and why it matters. In the next session, on sin and death, or human nature and death, we look at how does big history transform our understanding of human nature and death. And again, these questions for reflection and discussion might be useful If you're leading a study group between now and September, again, I'm open to suggestions to improve any aspect of this program or any of these questions or other questions that you would find useful. And again, this is the beta version, but when the final version is uploaded, I'm more than happy to respond to questions and comments via Skype, conference call, or speakerphone. And this is my contact information.